Well, thank you, Thomas. Professor Pogge will answer some questions.
Yeah, that's what I will do.
Should I take the question for you, or you want
I can do it if you're okay with that. Yeah, you start.
Actually, I've got two questions. The first one is, I've heard a book called End of Poverty. Well, I have to say I didn't go through the books, but I believe it's good for economic model which try to end poverty in the world. But at the same time, you mentioned about in international rules making, at least the US need to fight against China and Russia. So I'm just thinking, do you believe that only an economic model is able to end poverty, or that's actually more needed on that? That's my first question.
Yeah, only, say again the sentence, only?
Do you think there's do you think that economic model is good enough to...
economic model, yeah, okay. So how do we end it, yeah.
My second question is, there was a slide showing that there are inequality getting worse in 5 years in US, in the world, from 2010 to 2015. I'm just wondering, could that be caused by the quantitative easing in US after the financial tsunami? So that's
the quantitative easing had an impact. Yeah, okay, good. I'm probably not the best person to ask about the quantitative easing. I would say that the aftermath of the global financial crisis, which included the quantitative easing, certainly had an impact, and in two different ways. One was that, of course, the banks were great beneficiaries and intended beneficiaries of these maneuvers, that they were given cheap capital in order to revive them, make sure that they get through the crisis and that they remain solvent in the face of a lot of failed assets, basically. They had invested in assets that turned out to be, in the end, worth much less than they thought. Mortgage-backed securities, for example. And the ordinary savers who don't have a very large opportunity set for where they invest their money, they were the ones who were shortchanged now, right? People who invest in bonds or invest in savings accounts are not keeping up with inflation and are basically getting zero interest now. So I think it's true that there is a redistributive function, a redistributive element in these policies, which is not to say that this was the intent. The intent may well have been something else, but the effect is certainly that there is redistribution. What you see very clearly if you look at the US data is that the rank and file workers in the United States, employees, have decoupled from productivity increases. Productivity is continuing to rise, but their incomes are flatlined. And so for the last 20 years or so, you have no meaningful increase in the income of the US middle class. And so the middle class is essentially dropping back into the sort of famous American middle class is disappearing. And there's an enormous accumulation, as this slide, the earlier slide showed you, an enormous accumulation at the top. So, and then you had another question. Give me that. Yeah, what ideas? Yeah, so there, my sense is, again, I would start from the diagram, the spider diagram, with the various different pieces of the global architecture that I think are particularly pernicious. And I think each of these, you remember that diagram with protectionism, pharmaceutical patents, and so on. Each of these little modules, as I call them, of our global institutional order is one that can be changed independently of the others. So relatively small-scale reforms can each make a meaningful difference to the distribution of income and wealth in the world, and collectively, they can certainly solve the problem. So, and at least that's been my strategy. So I've worked on the Health Impact Fund, which is a way to get rid of the pernicious effects of pharmaceutical patents. I've worked on illicit financial flows by trying to create reforms of the tax haven system, which makes it very easy for rich corporations and individuals to escape taxation and to siphon capital out of developing countries. So each of these things has a very major influence that increases the centrifugal tendencies of our global economic system. And I think the best way forward is to reform them one by one, tackle them individually. So I don't think that there's any meaningful sense in trying for a massive overhaul of the whole system, like go to socialism or something like that. I think that's politically unfeasible and is also far too risky to try to do anything one fell swoop. Much better to tackle these modules. Good. Any other questions? 1, 2.
I have a question about the international humanitarian aid. Because it seems that they have many good resources to help other people. But one of the conditions when they go to the any disaster relief, they are saying that they are politically immune. So one of the principles that we don't talk about their political situation at all. So certainly they're trying to avoid whatever global order.
Yeah.
A little bit disturbs me that just go there first come first serve. Then when they talk about the political situation, no, you shouldn't. I'm wondering whether there any way we can use better their human resources because even the refugee and asylum or people in the European country, but they just keep on the water bottle, but they don't really talk about the more international order. I guess I'm wondering whether they will better use those the forces. What do you think about their approach? The political union will just help in person, not talk about the political situations.
Yeah, so there is, you're talking, for example, about effective altruism, that movement, right? And that is part and parcel of a whole long tradition of trying to address particular needs in developing countries at a piecemeal basis. Effective altruism does it in a more scientific way with randomized controlled trials and so on and so forth. But essentially, it's the same basic idea that you find needy people who need specific things like water or healthcare or education, and you go there and you provide it. And there are many problems with that sort of approach. And one is that the measurement is often problematic. You can measure within a small theater, but it's very, very difficult to measure in a larger theater. So, for example, it may be that you educate 50 people in a village, and you find that relative to the control group, they now do much better than the control group. But it's also possible that the control group actually does worse than they would have done if they hadn't been competing against and so on, so that the whole 100 are not doing any better than they would have done without your educational effort. And so we just had a conference, 2-day conference at Yale on the 6th and 7th of May, where we had Peter Singer and Angus Deaton clashing, basically, Deaton being skeptical on the data and so on. Deaton is the latest Nobel Prize winner in economics, for those who don't know. So that's one thing. The other thing is that even to the extent that these humanitarian projects work, it seems more intelligent to shut off the descending escalator than to try to run up the escalator, right? So imagine an escalator in a shopping center. It's coming down at you, and poor people are struggling to get up. And you help them. You give them water to drink and so on. Yeah, and so with your help, maybe they can make a little progress against the escalator. But wouldn't it be nice if you could simply turn the escalator off and thereby enable poor people really to make progress on their own? And that's exactly what, of course, these ideas are doing, right? I'm trying to find the escalator switch and to say, what are the structural mechanisms that are blowing a headwind into the faces of the poor, and how can we reduce that headwind, right? And for example, the headwind of bad governance, how can we improve that? And the headwind of protectionism, the headwind of intellectual property rights, blah, blah, blah. So yeah, that's exactly the idea. And so in the long run, those are the kinds of reforms that we should seek, and not the band-aids of, which is not to say that one shouldn't write checks and do the band-aids, of course, but one should certainly also think about these political reforms, even though that is much, much harder to think about, much, much harder to measure than these micro projects. Now, he was next, but he's gone, so yes.
You may have just answered it, but I couldn't hear the gentleman very well.
Yeah.
There's been a bit of an uptake in trends in large multinational companies to form corporate social responsibility departments, which for the time being seem to be mainly lip service.
Yeah.
But there seems to be research that shows that companies that implement this have an uptake in profits. Do you think that going forward those might stop being lip service and actually be part of the solution, or do you think that that would continue to always be part of the problem?
That depends on us, right? I mean, if we are intelligent and use this lever intelligently, we can make something of it. Now, how would we use it intelligently? I think we have to focus more than we have done so far on the lobbying of companies. So companies should, instead of having a little corporate social responsibility department which does a little nice thing here, builds a playground there and something else there, instead of that, we should say the first and foremost corporate responsibility of every company is to make sure that its domain of the economy is justly regulated. And what these companies do, for the most part, is they often lobby against just legislation, just regulation of themselves. And that destroys 5 times over any good thing that they do, right? They try to get rid of regulations, they try to increase their own permissions and so on and so forth. And that is what is doing enormous amounts of damage. So what companies have a fantastic opportunity, right? Often when you tell them you should do more by way of corporate social responsibility, often their answer is, I would love to, but I can't because my competitor isn't doing it either. And if I do more than my competitor, then I will die and he will survive and so on. And the answer to that is, don't do anything unilaterally, just lobby for just regulation, because that just regulation will bind your competitor as much as you. He will not gain an advantage over you, and you can afford to do that. But they don't do it, right? But that's what our task is. Our task is to say, you do want to do something good, you want to be a good citizen, that's what you should do. Okay, you were certainly next.
Yeah, so first of all, I enjoyed your talk, and my background is orthopedic surgery, so I'm not really in the realm of economics, and I just took over as the director of ethics. So I'm a big fan of behavioral ethics, understanding ethics in terms of what actually happens, and I have a very skeptical view because actually nothing has changed. Slavery continues to exist as it did in the medieval ages. It just assumes a different form and a different way. And from a very evolutionary perspective, we are the only species who have greed. There is no other species that is greedy as humans. And it's greed and avarice that are so powerful that is something that is almost impossible to change. But what I was taken up by was that these small efforts that people make will have an impact, and we shouldn't expect global poverty and global misery will ever disappear. And I think that's what I have been impressed by, both your Health Impact Fund initiative and what you said. It's small efforts will have some gain, and it would be naive to expect that everybody's going to be a good boy and everybody's going to give up on the greed and the avarice that has continued to, it's not It's not in these last 10 years that things have happened. It's happening, for centuries, the same phenomenon. And even the outflow of capital. I mean, the Hawala system is about 200 years old in India. That is the outflow of money from one state to another. And it was there in the Middle East, and the Arabs had perfected that. So I'd just like to have your comment on this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so on one half of what you said, I completely agree. And that is the half where you say that these small things are very meaningful, right? Small institutional reforms. This is not on, I think, is it?
Yes.
It is on, okay. So small reforms can have quite a significant effect. So getting something like the Health Impact Fund adopted would bring the world to a different equilibrium where we would have less poverty and a more even distribution of income and wealth. That in turn would rebalance the political system, would give the poor a little bit more of a chance to fend for themselves politically. It would shift the equilibrium. It wouldn't be a deep fundamental change, but it would be a step in the right direction that might bring additional steps within reach. So not to be underestimated. Now, the other point that you make is a very, very difficult point, which there are diverse views on that, right? Some people would say this greed that you rightly emphasized is hardwired in. It's sort of part of our biology, so to speak. Whereas other people would say this is something that is a meme rather than a gene. It is something that was created at some point, sort of a piece of culture, a cultural virus that has infected us. And once it emerged somewhere on Earth, of course it spread worldwide because those who had the virus, this incredible greed or cannibalism, those people then conquered the Earth, right? Nothing could be good enough for them. They didn't rest until they had the whole Earth under their control, and so that virus is now omnipresent. And the evidence for that would be, and again, we would have to look more closely at the evidence that I certainly have done, would be to see, look at how people lived, let's say, in North America before the Europeans arrived there. Did they have that greed, or did they live in harmony with nature? Of course, they had fights, but they didn't have this unlimited accumulation that you are talking about. In fact, they kind of laughed when people said, I want to own Manhattan. They said, what do you mean, own Manhattan? You can come here anytime you want, but you don't need to own it, just be here, right? So there was plenty there and plenty for others, and live and let live was the philosophy. And the idea that anybody would want to own 500,000 times more than they could ever consume was totally alien to them. And insofar as that's true, it's evidence against a sort of biological explanation and evidence in favor of a kind of cultural explanation. We may be in the soup either way, because once the virus has caught on and has basically infected the human population, or that part of the human population that matters in terms of power, we may be equally unable ever to get rid of it.
Yeah, fair enough. And my second point is, I've been to Somalia, I've been to Sudan, and I've been various places, part of the WHO education initiative. And very often I hear people saying that all these things are useless, and I see a tendency towards anarchy, and that's exactly what's happening. I mean, one can call terrorism another form of anarchy, because coming up against massive corporations, massive organizations, the small individual feels completely powerless. And I think the political order of things is changing imperceptibly towards a more anarchic situation. Definitely in the in the poor countries. I mean, from India to Indonesia. What is your take on that?
Yeah. So again, that is I think right. There's anarchy on the ground in various places, but there is a kind of profound anarchy also in the whole rulemaking business. This is maybe a slightly Marxist point, that you say that The workers are unfree in capitalism, but so are the capitalists. The capitalists have to act the way they act in order to maintain their position as capitalists. And so everybody has to seek their own interests to try to play the same game as best as possible, and that also includes the moves they have to make to change the rules of the game themselves. And that means that we are in a driverless car, so to speak, right? That our society develops with people doing things consciously, but what they do is essentially determined. They don't really have freedom to design the system. And so in that sense, it's anarchical. No one is minding the store. Nobody is driving the car. And we just have to see where we come out, right? Marx had a beautiful story. He said that at the end of prehistory, which is this period, we will be chucked out on the green meadow of socialism, and it's all automatic. You don't have to worry about it. It will just happen automatically. The proletariat will, right? No, sorry, this is not a winning theory. We won't be so lucky. And so what we need to do is somehow get possession of the steering wheel, right? And there are plenty of indicators that say that if we don't manage relatively quickly to get some global governance institutions going, serious global government sort of institutions going, this world will fall apart. We will have more and more countries possessing weapons of mass destruction, possessing dangerous technologies, including biological weapon systems, and sooner or later, it's just a matter of time, sooner or later something will go wrong and we will face a major catastrophe. So what we need to do is marginalize the capacity for violence as a counter in international bargaining and negotiations, try to institute something like the rule of law, and also, of course, with it, a more democratic rule-making where the law is indeed made by good reasons and arguments and popular support, rather than by the threat of military force, which plays an enormous role in present politics. But we are far cry from there, and it's not clear whether we can, in the time remaining, get that curve. So, and then you get
Thank you.
next. Yeah.
You used the analogy of the descending escalator,
Yeah.
right? And I'm just wondering, besides stopping the escalator, whether there's any chance of moving it in an opposite direction a little bit.
Moving the escalator in the opposite direction?
Yeah, I mean, and one example that I've been thinking is, at least in the States, in the US, people like Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, and even more recently Mark Zuckerberg, they have been very forthcoming in pledging to give away most. In the case of Zuckerberg, he pledged that he would give away 99% of his wealth. I mean, I think that moving in that direction is not only stopping. I mean, what do you think about this? About the 62 richest person in the world, is there any prospect of them making a substantial donation of their wealth?
Yeah, they make substantial donations, and that, of course, can catch on. But I see that precisely as another instance of our running up the escalator. So there is a system that systematically has centrifugal tendencies, makes inequality greater and greater, and then these people are, so to speak, blowing against the wind by throwing some of the money that they make at the top back down to people at the bottom. So that slows the tendency towards inequality, but unless it becomes a really massive mass movement, it's just not going to really be a game changer. And part of the reason for that is that they focus, again, on things that keep the system the way it is or actually defend the system. So one thing that's interesting, I've tried to interest the Gates Foundation in my Health Impact Fund project, right? And they don't like it. It's for them, this is too much sort of shaking the system up. And how did Bill Gates make all his money? Through intellectual property rights. When you download Microsoft Word or Microsoft Office or whatever you download, it costs Bill Gates nothing. your download costs nothing, and you pay $100 for it or whatever it is. And so his money is money that comes from intellectual property rights, and the whole Gates Foundation is funded by that. And what I want to do is change the system. I want to move away from these intellectual property rights, from these patents, from these markups. And so the people at the Gates Foundation say, why should we support that? This is, we are slaughtering the cow that lays the golden eggs. I know, this is not a good.
Can I just follow up?
Yeah, sure.
I mean, there's a difference between your strategy and the suggestion of asking rich people to donate. In the late 70s, there was someone who wrote a paper in Wall Street Affairs. I think I forgot the title, but there's a paper in which someone wrote a paper arguing for people's capitalism, which is a hybrid between, keep the capitalist system running, but when someone pass away, then his wealth has to go back to the state, his country. Now, of course, that would be too radical.
Yeah.
But encouraging them to give a substantial part, even 10%, 20%, 30%, that would make a huge difference, and still keep paying capitalism as it is.
Yeah. So we have to talk about what we mean by capitalism. One thing that I certainly want to keep is markets. I think markets are very, very good mechanisms. So, for example, to solve the problem of climate change, we should have a carbon market. We should say that the true price, the true cost of pollution should be priced into the products, and the way to price it in is by saying anybody who wants to release carbon into the atmosphere has to pay for on a per molecule basis for that. So I'm all in favor of markets, and with the ownership, I'm just not sure that we should have this distribution based on market for capital and so on. So financial markets, investment markets, whether we should allow these enormous differences. Now, if we could put a break between generations and mitigate or disallow the intergenerational transmission of wealth and advantage, that would be a big step forward, of course, because this accumulation wouldn't happen. But first of all, there's a big question of whether it's feasible, because, of course, people will, if they know that once they die, their wealth will go back into the pool, they may say that, I will give the money back beforehand or under the table or whatever. So, and yeah, I think it would be very difficult to implement. But it would be a step in the right direction. One thing that people have thought about is a basic starting capital. So everybody, when they become 18 years old, they get $10,000 or something. So that would mitigate a little bit, at least these differences, inequalities that are transmitted from one generation to the next. You were next. You have got the microphone already. Yeah.
Professor Pogge, may I ask, you have mentioned that the slavery system is unjust and ought to be abolished because it should not compare with the future that it is being better. May I ask if you have mentioned that the institutional order that causes harm has many direct influence on the poor? Should it be directly abolished instead of applying egalitarian principle or somehow some reform?
Yeah, you spoke about the slavery system at the beginning?
Because you said it is unjust, and somehow the institutional order nowadays is somehow unjust as the slavery system, as it caused many harm.
Yeah, I'm not sure it's as unjust as the slavery system. That I didn't mean to say. I just meant to say that the fact that slavery got better is no defense of slavery, and the fact that poverty got better is no defense of the remaining poverty. That was the parallel. So
I want to know why the government, you are not suggesting to directly abolish the institutional harm, for example, the tax or the trade barriers instead of just...
No, I do want to abolish them, and I do want to reform those modules that I mentioned. I do want to change those, in the case of protectionism, I would say that maybe it is okay for rich countries to maintain some protectionist measures, so for cultural reasons, right? So the French, for example, will want to maintain a dairy industry because cheese is a very important part of their culture and so on. So what I would say is, let us introduce a kind of tax on protectionism. So if you pay subsidies to your farmers in your own country, then you have to pay a percentage of that subsidy into an international pool for the benefit of poor countries who are harmed by the protectionism, right? So that way, the farmers in countries that otherwise could import into France get compensated for their lost export opportunities.
So you're saying we still have to have some protection on the local.
We don't have to, for sure. So I'm not saying we have to, but I'm saying that maybe we should not be rigidly disallowing all these protectionist measures. Maybe we should allow countries to do it if they pay compensation to those who are harmed. The current situation is simply intolerable. The current situation is that poor countries are not allowed any protectionism at all. They have to let anything into their country, any competition from the rich countries, including financial advisors and all sorts of dirty people and businesses. And the rich countries retain the privilege to protect certain markets of themselves. This is an asymmetrical and unjust system which the rich countries imposed simply by virtue of their stronger bargaining power. So at the very least, they should pay compensation for the protectionist measures that they maintain.
So you're suggesting that we should, you have suggested that the rich country have the privilege, but could I say that you think that the compensation is more important than somehow abolishing the institutional privilege, the privilege caused by, for example, the international resources privilege, etc.
Give me the question again.
Are you meaning that compensation is a better way to resolving the world poverty instead of resolving?
In this particular case, I'm not saying in all cases, but in this particular case, I think that it would be politically much easier to implement that solution, and it would have as good an effect, right? So if you compare the two solutions, the solution with compensation is a solution which makes both parties better off than they would be under the disallowing protectionism. If you disallow protectionism, the French are very pissed off because they lose their cheese market maybe, and the people in the developing country have less resources. If you allow the French to protect their cheese market, if they pay a penalty to the poor countries, so to speak, that may make the French happier than they would be with no protectionism, and may also give enough compensation to the poor countries to make them happy with that result. So that's the idea, that you get a win-win, a situation that is better for both parties in this particular case. In other cases, I would not want to do that. I would not do it with arms trade, for example. I think that you should not be sending weapons to Africa or now to the Middle East, as many rich countries are doing, even if you pay compensation, right? The weapons are killing people, and even if you then compensate by somehow sending doctors or something, this would still be worse than sending no more weapons into these areas.
Thank you.
Okay. So, here, 1, 2.
Professor Pogge, Fascinating presentation, very big ideas, big concepts, delivered very succinctly. So thank you very much for that. For me, the question I raise is, in the next 5 to 10 years, do you think our human march to reduce human rights deficits will be more of a struggle or easier? From the points you raised, there are the positives and there are negatives. The positive example that really surprised me was last November in Paris. We've got COP21. I think there are 180 countries. There's even one country not agreeing to sign on to it with no agreement on reducing carbon. That to me was quite amazing, the supranational thing. Somehow managed to agree on something which benefited the poor in particular. So that was a very big positive. But to the negatives, however, the world is getting more dominated by one or two big countries. Europe was big, but then Britain is spinning off. And from what I read from newspapers, even like Germany, 48% of Germans want to be out, and then 45% of French people want to be out of Euro. So we used to have US, Europe, Asia wasn't quite there, and I will argue that we're probably not there either. So your argument of supranationals being dominated by economies of scales and operators there, including big multinationals, can use regulatory capture and somehow draw the agenda for the world. Now that seems to be a losing battle to me. The world is still dominated by the US, increasingly so. That's one negative. The other negative I have is on the aging population. We look at the world significantly more indebted than a decade ago. And the welfare needs are even more. So people, even though they're very compassionate about helping people who are developing in the developing countries, but they have got their own woes, onshore, domestic issues that will burden their overload the compassion count. So they couldn't really help and reach out so much more than a decade ago. That's the second negative. But the third negative has to be technology. It's really unregulated. We are now, if we used to tax the banks for being sinners, bending over backwards to help the rich and manage bigger asset base. We're also doing the same thing by effectively destroying jobs on a very massive scale. People with low skills in developing countries, there may not even be factories there. They will all be done by robots in developed countries. So my concern really is, technology, aging, and supranationals seem to make our march to reducing human rights deficits should make them more difficult. Yet, on the other hand, we had a COP21. How should we look at the next 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, so the COP21, I have a completely different view from yours, and I see COP21 also as quite negative. I was there for the week, and how I see it is this. The governments are in the driver's seat. They are the ones that determine what the infrastructure, the energy infrastructure is like, and through these decisions, they determine how much CO2 gets into the atmosphere. And the governments have for 25 years done nothing. Since 1990, the problem is very well understood, and the populations became increasingly nervous and finally pretty desperate, saying, do something. You are sitting in the driver's seat. Slow the bus down. Do something. And the governments didn't do anything. And finally, in December of 2015, the governments had a wonderful idea. They said, let's all vote on what the speed of the bus should be. And you know what? The people screamed, yeah, let's vote 2 degrees, 2 degrees. And the government said, no, 1.5 degrees, even better than what you want. And I was in Paris, and the people there, the negotiators, were in tears. They were falling into each other's arms, saying, we have this fantastic victory, 1.5 degrees. And so basically we have a bus that is speeding at very high speed in the direction of a town that is full of playing children. It has no brakes. It's still going way too far, but all the members in the bus, all the people have voted that the bus will go 20 when it reaches the city. 1.5 degrees is completely unreachable. Nowhere near, right? If you take all the individually, nationally determined pledges together, If every country does exactly what it pledges, we'll get to 2.7. 2.7, that's vastly, vastly more than 1.5. Nowhere near 2 even. So this 1.5 is a moon figure. We'll probably break through it in the next few years, right? Carbon emissions are rising still. And China, I was just there for a whole week of talks about climate change. China is saying we will peak by 2030. In other words, we'll go up. We are now the biggest polluter in the world, and we will go up for another 15 years before we peak. And of course, what China needs to do is, from now on, completely decarbonize all new energy generation capacity. Not a single new coal-fired power plant. Every new generating capacity has to be renewable. They're not going to do that. The Indians are not going to do that. Pretty much nobody's going to do that. My Germans are actually doing pretty well. They had recently a day where they had 90% renewable for that day. It was a sunny day with wind. And on a sunny day with wind, they can do 90%. So I'm very proud of them, which is much better than any other country. But I'm afraid that I'm very, very pessimistic about global warming. The science now tells us that things are worse than predicted. So the temperature increase is faster than predicted. The melting is faster than predicted. There is a chance that significant bits of ice are going to break off Antarctica, which means they immediately raise the water levels. So I see this not at all as an optimistic thing. It's a new propaganda trick of our governments to simply announce something, to express a wish that is even more dramatic, even more wonderful, even more optimistic than what we have hoped for. And that is supposed to give us the feeling that the governments are on our side and that everything will be all right. But it's just another way of kicking the can down the road. And on the other 3 points, I totally agree. And on the aging point, I just feel, and you also said that already, that there is a spirit of pessimism, a spirit of we can't do anything. And the one thing that makes you, that disempowers you the most is your own belief that you have no power. Right? We as citizens, we have the power to turn this around, but we don't believe that we do. And so we do small little things that have no real effect. So that's what's missing. And that's partly aging, but partly demoralization of things having gone in the wrong direction for 30 years and people having lost this. You know, when I was young, long ago, I was a child of the 60s, and we had this unbelievable optimism, right? The problems of the world we solve in the next 5 years, and then we'll see what else we can do. Space travel or something interesting, and we had this boundless optimism about what was achievable, and of course we achieved very little of it. These two.
You just gave me the word to refer to the slide that you're showing up there with the citizen. What can we as a citizen do? I understand your slide as a call for all of us to do something. Mm-hmm. And could you be a bit more practical? For example, what could we do to shield the poor from the harms, we as normal citizens?
Yeah. So the 2 points that I made there were things that you can do as one individual, even without the others, and then things that we can do together by organizing and mobilizing. My preferred avenue is the second. I want us to do something together, organize and mobilize. And why has that failed in the last 20, 30 years? I've already spoken about demoralization, but there's one other very important thing, and that is that we have not managed to collaborate. My paradigm example is the World Social Forum. The World Social Forum is a great meeting of all the progressive forces from all over the world. And it's a very colorful meeting in every way, the way people dress and so on, but also the ideas that they express. there are 50,000 ideas, and people are applauding one another's ideas. They say, oh, how wonderful, oh, another good idea. And every idea has about 5 or 6 people supporting it, and of course none of these ideas gets enough support to be implemented. And so what we need to do is to agree not just which ideas are good and which are not so good, but also to agree on a schedule. Which ideas are we going to push first and foremost? We would be invincible if we could just put the ideas in a temporal sequence and say, let's do this one first, and once we've nailed this, we go to this one and put all our force behind this one. And it is somehow, it seems to be beyond our capacities. You know who can do it? The people, the big corporations. They're very, very good at overcoming their differences and having a joint program of action. Example, this TRIPS agreement, like intellectual property rights under the World Trade Organization. The big companies came together, pharmaceutical, agribusinesses, the software companies, the entertainment companies. They all had different concerns and different interests. They sat together, they overcame their differences, they agreed to a joint agenda, and once they had that, they descended upon Washington like a ton of bricks and said, Bill Clinton, when you go to Uruguay to the WTO, this is what you bring us home. This is the bacon that we want. And Clinton went and brought it home for them, and they supported him ever since. Why can't we do that? Why can't we agree, right? My favorite first item is the Health Impact Fund. But I'm perfectly willing to support something else. But imagine the Health Impact Fund, imagine a few million people supporting it, and getting that adopted. It would change the spirit of pessimism, the spirit of, we can't ever get anything done. It would give us a run on the board. It would foster a spirit of optimism, and we could then go to the next thing with redoubled effort and strength. And we could, step by step, we could really turn this thing around.
May I just ask, who is we?
Well, we is the people who think that things are dramatically going in the wrong direction, that if we go on the present trends continuing, we will just run into disaster sooner or later. Be it a big security disaster, be it continued poverty aggravated by climate change. People who think that the current governments and their negotiations are simply not going to solve the problem. This is the point that the colleague made about nobody minding the store, right? I mean, everybody basically being on this self-enrichment trip, which inexorably leads to a increasing inequality and aggravation of the financial problems, political problems, ecological problems, and so on. I mean, we is the majority. Very clearly a majority.
First of all, thank you, Professor. I totally agree with you that the international rule has to be changed in order to to save the poor guys or to break the unjust reality. But I think that, sorry that I'm not very familiar with the global policy, but I think I can see that there are lots of NGOs to help the poor countries like in Africa, and they rely on our donation. But actually, I really don't think it is a sustainable way, because that means the poor countries have to rely on our donation, but not by themselves. So and I also a little bit desperate about the global policy, because just like the climate change policy, it seems every country take care of their own benefits, or you can say their local people's benefits, rather than the global change. Like when they're arguing about how much carbon dioxide should be reduced, the ice in the South Pole still melting. So in some situation that time just gone, we may not have that a lot of time to consume, to negotiate. So, and also it seems to me that it's like you can just do whatever you want, but not in my backyard. So do you think there's some kind of human nature that inhibits the global negotiation? Or do you really think that we are the majority? Thank you.
Yeah. Good. Okay, so I agree with you on the NGOs, and we've discussed that already quite a bit, right? I think the NGOs can do some useful work, but of course the real solution to the global poverty problem lies in institutional reforms. So I agree with that completely. Now, back to the climate change problem. You present the climate change problem as, I think, as more or less a collective action problem. So it's a collective action problem in the sense that each person's, when the person takes a polluting action, then the benefit of the action is mine alone, and the harm is shared with 7 billion people. So that's right, and then it's difficult to negotiate and so on. I think the problem is actually even worse than a collective action problem of the standard sort, where there is a solution that makes everybody better off, right? Like the prisoner's dilemma. There's a solution that makes everybody better off if everybody collaborates or cooperates. But here, there is the special situation that the people who are contributing the most to the problem, by far the most, are also very well able to protect themselves from the problem. So we have a ruling elite in the world, the top 5%, let's say, who can live anywhere they want. A rich person in Hong Kong, if they want to live in Canada, they can. If they want to live in Denmark, they can. In Britain, sure. They can go anywhere they want, and so they can make themselves safe from climate change. If the air in Beijing is too polluted, they can go to Canada or whatever. So these people are responsible for the large part of the pollution, and they're pretty much invulnerable. Now, there are two different ways in which you can solve a problem like climate change. One is the bargaining power way, the other is the moral way. The bargaining power way, you say, who should pay for cleaning up the mess? Those people who suffer the most from the mess. Those who have the most to lose. Those who are most at risk. Who are they? The poor people of Bangladesh. Bangladesh should pay money because they are under so much threat. They have so much to lose. They should pay money to China, to Switzerland, to the United States to stop polluting. Now, the problem is the people in Bangladesh don't have the money, right? They can't pay the millionaires of Switzerland to stop driving big cars. So that's the bargaining problem. If you think about it as a moral problem, you say, well, those people should pay who are making the mess, who are polluting the air. But those people who are polluting the air are going to say, make us, right? Do us something. The United States says, force me, try. Right? And so the Americans are never going to agree to the moral solution, and the Bangladeshis are never going to be able to implement the bargaining solution. And the two solutions are very far from each other, and anything in between is not going to be acceptable to either side. So that's why I think it's such a wicked problem. It's a really very, very difficult to solve problem, because the distribution of cost is just impossible to allocate in such a way that everybody accepts their share, unlike the prisoner's dilemma.
Although I know it's a little bit overrun, but may I ask one follow-up question?
Ask the boss.
The last question, maybe.
Yeah,
Sure.
Maybe very short. So let's talk about the bargaining way. The problem is that the rich people or the dominating countries hold most of the power to bargain. So the question is how? We all know that they have to action, but how to drive them to action? Because they hold the bargaining power, right?
Yeah.
They have the money to go for some maybe lobbying.
Yeah.
So they have reasons to ignore the majority voice.
Yes.
Because they have the power. So still the problem is how to drive them.
Yeah. Yeah, sure. That's the question I ask myself every day. And there are 3 different answers to it. Who can make the US government do anything, right? Who can really force or push the US government to do something? Well, one thing is its own citizens. Its own citizens, if they demand something, if they band together, they can be successful. So, for example, in the 1980s, I was involved in the fight against apartheid, and I wanted the United States government to stop supporting South Africa, the South African white government. And we got Columbia University to divest. They sold all the stocks in companies that were doing business in South Africa, and thereby we helped a little bit to create a powerful popular atmosphere against apartheid, which in the end forced the American government to stop supporting that apartheid regime. Similarly, the movement against the Vietnam War finally got the war ended earlier than it would have ended otherwise. So that's one force, the force of the people. A second force is the force of the courts. So you can, and that's what we do with climate change, we are trying to mobilize, we are trying to find ways of suing governments and forcing them through their own courts to reduce emissions. And that has succeeded in the Netherlands, it succeeded in Pakistan. So we've had some really nice winning cases of that.
But how to deal with Protestantism?
Hmm?
Do you think Protestantism is a problem to deal with these things?
What, Protestantism?
Protectionism.
Protectionism. Yeah. But again, protectionism, it could work, right? If we convince the population of a country that protectionism is unfair, they could maybe force the hand of their government. Or if we find a legal basis for arguing that protectionism is illegal, right? These are possibilities, and they may not work in every case, but these are 2 different avenues that might work. The third avenue is to try to find reform proposals that can be made prudentially attractive to governments, where we say that here's a reform that would be good for the poor and also good for you. And there are not many reforms like that, but there are a few. So these are 3 ways forward. You have to think very, very carefully which reform project you start first. What is one which is politically feasible under existing conditions? And that's a very difficult question. Okay.
Well, thank you very much. Let's give Professor Pogge a big hand. We have overrun, but in case you want to talk a bit more to him, there's coffee and tea, as well as wine and cheese outside. So I think it's across from the other side, right? Across from here. So I think Professor Pogge will, and some of us will hang around for another half an hour. So if you're free, you're welcome to join us. Okay. Thank you very much.